Good evening. I'm Olivier Mellet, Handyman Director of the Clark Art Institute. Thank you everybody who are in person, who are virtually. Sorry. Thank you also to Will Schmener for their coordination, his coordination with the curatorial team for this lecture. And I'm above all thrilled to now introduce Sarah Grandin, the Clark-Getty Paper Project Curatorial Fellow. Sarah Grandin holds the Clark-Getty Curatorial Fellowship, a 2-year postdoctoral fellowship supported by a generous award from the Getty Paper Project. Sarah received her PhD in 2021 from Harvard University in the history of art and architecture. Her dissertation focuses on issues of scale in the graphic and decorative art in the age of Louis XIV. From 2017 to 2019, Grandin was a visiting fellow at the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, one of the most selective and prestigious graduate schools in France. At the Clark, Sarah has been instrumental in the development of a planned 2022-2023 exhibition of 18th century French drawing in collaboration with the Bibliothèque Nationale de France. And the exhibition will take place this winter. Although Sarah has been thoroughly immersed in works on paper for the main project at the Clark, for this evening, she has chosen to focus on a French 18th century painting in the permanent collection. This is a very charming and very well-known painting by Étienne Aubry, Farewell to the Wet Nurse. Her talk this evening will focus on the painting. I would be very happy to welcome Sarah. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that warm welcome, and thank you to those of you who are joining us in person and to all of you who are with us virtually. I really appreciate this hybrid mode of engagement, which allows us to get a broader reach for our ideas. This painting centers on a moment of transition. A rupture in circumstances can be difficult to navigate at any age, but as anyone who has spent time with children can attest, toddlers can have an especially difficult time with changes in their routine and surroundings. This little boy with choppily shorn blonde hair is visibly distressed, red-faced and teary-eyed. He has just been passed from the arms of the woman at left, who changed him, comforted him, and breastfed him in the first years of his life, to the arms of the woman at right, his biological mother. Though her profile is receding and in partial shadow, we can make out the nursemaid's sadness in her furrowed brow and downturned mouth. The boy extends his hand towards her neck, his anchor, begging her to take him back. With great composure and the perfect curls and rosy complexion of a woman blessed with domestic help and uninterrupted sleep, the mother lifts him coolly onto her lap. The ostentatious plumes of her headpiece, which signal her elevated class to the viewer, form the apex of a pyramid. The artist, Étienne Aubry, chose a donkey as her steed, a choice that the late art historian Mary Sheriff suggested might prompt comparison to the Holy Family's flight into Egypt. When I look at this picture, I am of two minds. On the one hand, I think, how could you bear to send your child away for years at a time? On the other hand, I think, what were this fictional mother's options? What did it mean to be a woman, as a servant, a mother, or both in metropolitan France in the 18th century? In my initial research, I have been met by and large with an opaque veil around these questions, because what we see in paintings, prints, and drawings of motherhood and domestic servitude in this period is so thoroughly prescriptive. While details of contemporary dress and setting may suggest a degree of verisimilitude, what we are actually witness to as we examine the visual record is predominantly male opinions about how family dynamics should or should not play out. In this painting, the very conditions of this encounter are themselves dramatized for the delectation of the viewer. For in fact, most children sent out to nurse in the countryside were transported to and from by the cartload, not shepherded by their parents. In this painting, we see two important figures embroiled in the exchange of milk and money, the husbands. On the left stands the wet nurse's spouse, who leans forward humbly, hands clasped in supplication, as if pleading the boy's parents to take good care of him. This sentimental attachment to the boy is manifest despite the fact that while nursing the child, his wife would have been forbidden from having sex with him out of the errant clinical assumption that it would spoil her milk. To the right, the biological father stands apart, aloof, his back to the viewer, his hand decisively removed from the fray, his right foot pointed in a foppish manner. And yet, despite his physical detachment from the group, he was likely the one who orchestrated the entire operation. Most of the information we have about the movement of infants to the countryside to live with wet nurses comes from three kinds of documents linked to fathers: the contracts between fathers and wet nurses, the death records of infants who perished while sent out, and complaints lodged by wet nurses against biological fathers for not paying the bills. In this lecture, I will describe the moral and pictorial landscape from which this painting emerges and trace the way critiques of maternal absence are created through manipulations of women's physical and psychological presence in prints, paintings, and drawings. Looking at this body of images brings me to two bigger questions that I will raise but not fully resolve this evening. These are, in the context of the French Enlightenment, who has choice and who gets to feel? As we shall see, ideals of motherhood were inextricably bound to strictures of gender, class, and race that were both reflected in and reinforced by the visual culture of the second half of the 18th century. Before turning to the broader social context in which this painting was made, I want to share a few facts about the specific artistic environment in which it was painted, exhibited, and sold. Its creator, Étienne Aubry, was born in Versailles in 1745 before dying at the young age of 36 in 1781. He was admitted to the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture in 1771 as a portraitist, although as this selection of works by him shows, he would ultimately forge his reputation as a painter of intimate genre scenes. He exhibited Farewell to the Wet Nurse at the Salon of 1777, where it was well received but little commented upon. At the same salon, he presented another painting depicting an episode from the life of an upper-class family, perhaps the same one. In this picture, now at the Nelson Atkins, a child of about 4 is brought to visit his infant brother at the wet nurse. While undoubtedly simple, the interior is clean. The gleaming copper pot and nearby vegetables, suggestive of a well-ordered and adequately stocked home. Notably, neither painting casts aspersions on the wet nurse or questions her commitment to her young charge. Soon after its salon debut, the painting joined the collection of the Marquis de Very, a nobleman of Provençal origins with a penchant for contemporary French art, including works by Jean-Honoré Fragonard and Jean-Baptiste Greuze. Like Aubry, both of these artists specialized in intimate, domestic subjects, although their approaches and techniques could not have been more dissimilar. Robert Delaunay's 1779 etching engraving after Aubry's painting is dedicated to a family friend of the Marquis de Very, Anne-Marie Perronque de Moras, or Madame de Merle. She was the wife of the Comte de Merle's, of the Comte de Very's friend, the Comte de Merle, a fellow aristocrat from Avignon. It would be tempting to read this inscription as more than an acknowledgement of friendship, and as a sign of Madame de Merle's stance on the subject of wet nursing, which had become, as we shall see, a topic of heated debate. But while Madame de Merle had 3 children who lived to adulthood, nothing is known of her practices or preferences as a mother. All we know of her is that as a young adolescent, she orchestrated her own escape from a convent to elope with an older suitor at gunpoint. Only her sizable dowry saved her from the scandal. In France, women of the upper classes generally had 2 destinies. They could become nuns or they could wed. If assigned to the latter path, their responsibility was to produce heirs. The general consensus among male philosophes from Diderot to Rousseau was that women were physically weak and soft, and thus best suited to a sedentary existence and to maternity. Laws around marriage, divorce, inheritance, and custody all reinforced patriarchal hegemony. In his 1775 treatise, Système physique et moral de la femme, the doctor Pierre Roussel argued that nature bound woman to her role as childbearer. Such medical anthropological theories were also extended in the 18th century to construct notions of race and racial hierarchy. The so-called science of the Enlightenment was wielded to limit the universality of universal rights, a reality that intellectuals such as Condorcet and Olympe de Gouges would eventually call into question to varying degrees and with lackluster outcomes in their critiques of female disenfranchisement and in their calls for the abolition of slavery. This painting by Aubry's more senior contemporary, Greuze, takes the premise that women were best suited to motherhood and stretches it to its orgiastic breaking point. 6 adoring children anchor her to her chair, rendering her immobile, the very condition the Dr. Roussel deemed natural. Her husband, their father, has just returned home from the hunt to find his wife laid flat out, breast still exposed from a recent bout of nursing. While the painting's commissioner forbade its exhibition at the 1765 Salon, viewers would come to know the image through its reproduction in print. Diderot described the father as pleased and proud. Madame Geoffrin, one of the leading salon hosts of Paris, found the whole scene distasteful, apparently, saying that, I quote, she could not bear the fricassee of children. As modern viewers, we are likely unsettled by Greuze's histrionics, by his unbridled prurience, and by the conflation of erotic and maternal responses to being touched. Greuze regularly depicted his female subjects, from bourgeois mothers to laundresses, in a harsh moral light, either condemning or condoning their choices. The mother in Silence seems to have received the artist's approval. With her youngest asleep in her lap after a nourishing meal of mother's milk, she gestures tenderly towards her snoozing middle child, calmly advising the eldest to put his horn away. Despite the rustic surroundings, objects in the painting point to the mother's dutiful attentions. These details include the basket of linens, the toy drum, and especially the cradle. A 1756 ordinance proclaimed that the various bureaus of wet nursing, called the Bureau des Recommanderesses, must not place a baby with a nurse unless she could provide written proof from her parish priest that she possessed a cradle. The fear was that bed sharing would lead to suffocation. In contrast to his depiction of this young, industrious mother, Greuze was unsparing in his judgment of the business of wet nursing. He produced 2 drawings after which prints were made. That shown on the left depicts a newborn lifted from a basket into a coven of nurses. The baby has likely been brought to the rural household by a meneur, a person responsible for moving babies and nurses between Paris and the countryside. The second print on the right shows a young child reluctant to leave his nurse for the care of his biological mother. Both scenes are marked by chaos. You can almost hear the cries of scampering children and the barks of ill-behaved dogs. While Aubry's painting focuses on the emotional trauma embedded in the practice of wet nursing, Greuze's scenes evoke the insalubrious bedlam into which a child was plunged and from which he was not easily retrieved. Greuze's assessment of these conditions is made even more explicit in another painting, Les Sèvreuses, or the Weaners. The space looks suspiciously dark, dingy, and drafty, and the sorry state of the laundry seems to suggest a poorly run household. A cat naps in a cradle, and a boy releases a bird from a cage, in a breakdown of order and animal containment that makes us suspicious of the women's capacity to keep this many toddlers safely in line. The woman at center, her chair pushed to the painting's edge, seems to dare us to comment on her manner of running her domestic enterprise. Her defiant, petulant air is reminiscent of that Greuze crafted for his laundress, a painting now at the Getty. Of her, Diderot wrote, "She is charming, but she's a rascal I wouldn't trust an inch." While more provocative and coquettish than the central figures of the Sèvreuses, the laundress similarly asserts that female domestics were conniving. The women one let into one's home to prepare one's food, tend to one's children, and handle one's intimate apparel were duplicitous and not to be relied on. This characterization of the laundress was informed by her class, but also compounded by her gender. Women were thought to be fickle, impulsive, and governed only by their capricious passions. The mistrust of women servants extended to critiques of wet nurses beyond the realm of painting. In an early pediatric orthopedic treatise, Nicolas-André de Boisrigard warned that inattentive wet nurses could cause goiter, a swelling of the neck in young children, by shaking them or not properly supporting their heads, as illustrated here. Laws and organizations existed to oversee the wet nursing industry in 18th century France, which were meant to protect both infants and their caretakers. And yet infant mortality and failure to pay wet nurses were both staggering. Disease, malnourishment, and fatal accidents were rampant. Between 1770 and 1776, 66,000 nurslings were placed with nurses by the Bureau of Wet Nurses in Paris. Of these, 45,000 were returned to their parents, while a staggering 21,000 died while in the care of wet nurses, a mortality rate of 31%. Even more dire was the fate of foundlings, those orphaned or abandoned children. 68% of the babies admitted to foundling hospitals in Paris died before their first birthday. We must remember that at this time, formula had not yet been invented, and so there was no suitable substitute for human milk. Infant mortality for those infants nursed by their mothers was still high, but much lower at 20%. A physician from the Orme wrote, "The dwellings of many nurses are badly aired. Several have only a single room in which are crowded together a number of beds and chests. Some have but a single bed and 3 nurslings. The wet nurses are the poorest women in the district. The nurse, staggering under the work of her own household and the burden of her own children, can pay but little attention to the cleanliness and physical exercise of which these children are in such need." In 1785, the playwright Beaumarchais spurred the creation in Lyon of an institute of assistance for poor nursing mothers, financed in part by the success of his play, The Marriage of Figaro. The event is depicted in this print, in which allegories of charity and generosity give money to an assembly of poor nursing mothers, allowing them to return to their natural duties and liberate their husbands from debtor's prison. Indeed, women forced to work, but without adequate income to cover nursing fees, made up a large portion of those who used wet nurses. Infant mortality, therefore, was also linked to class and poverty. Beaumarchais wrote, somewhat hyperbolically, I quote, "Out of 100 infants born, wet nursing carries off 80. Maternal nursing will preserve 80. Each mother will have nursed her son. The father will no longer go to prison. Women will be more modest, more attached to their homes. Little by little, we make it shameful to send one's children away. Nature, customs, and the nation will all gain equally." He asserted that more children would survive to serve the nation as soldiers, workers, and sailors. Indeed, much of the anxiety around wet nursing stemmed from an unfounded fear of depopulation in France. The issue of maternal nursing was a national, political, and economic problem, one that doctors and philosophers were determined to address and rectify. The surge we witnessed in discourse promoting maternal breastfeeding and condemning mercenary nursing emerged in part from a reasonable critique of the industry. It was also the product, however, of new ideas about childhood, the family, and what a woman's so-called natural role was in protecting those institutions. Jean-Jacques Rousseau has been positioned as the locus classicus for a move toward maternal breastfeeding in late 18th century France. Before I share citations from that text and an image affiliated with it, it seems important to note, however, that he was not writing from a vacuum. Multiple medical publications were published throughout the 18th century that touted the superiority of maternal over mercenary nursing, and many of them were sufficiently popular to merit reprinting. Notably, the fashionable Parisian midwife, Madame Marie-Angélique Annelle Rebours, published a treatise titled Advice to Mothers Who Wish to Feed Their Children in 1767. The frontispiece to Joseph Rollin's 3-part book on child rearing shows the importance of breastfeeding and freedom of movement to children's health. In Émile, his treatise on education, first published in 1762, Rousseau laid out recommendations for healthy child rearing, which included freedom of movement and maternal nursing, shown in this frontispiece. The philosophe was unsparing in his critique of mothers who sent their children to wet nurses. He wrote, "Since mothers, despising their first duty, have no longer wanted to feed their children, it has been necessary to confide them to mercenary women who, thus finding themselves mothers of alien children on whose behalf nature tells them nothing, have sought only to save themselves effort." The result of this laziness, Rousseau claims, is swaddling and the restriction of the child's movement. Despite the fact that it was a woman's duty to produce children and suckle them, he did raise the following question: is it preferable for a child to suck the milk of a healthy nurse over that of a spoiled mother? This too should be intolerable to a mother who should not be able to stand seeing her child love another woman as much as and more than her, he claims. He writes, "Where I found a mother's care, do not I owe a son's attachment." The resilience and solidity of the very family unit depended, Rousseau asserted, on the bond between mother and child. It is safe to say that this concern for a child's over-attachment to his nurse and the centrality of mothers and wet nurses to early childhood development is played out in Aubry's composition. The men are mere supplements. The child's moral integrity degenerates, Rousseau claims, from this initial maternal rejection of her natural duties. I quote, "From the correction of this single abuse would soon result a general reform. Nature would soon have reclaimed all its rights. Let women once again become mothers. Men will soon become fathers and husbands again," end quote. Rousseau's recommendations were also presaged in the entry for mère, or mother, in Diderot and d'Alembert's Encyclopédie, first published in 1751, in which they stated that a mother's first duty was to suckle her children. As Valérie Lestanger has stated, this universalizing assertion of a natural duty fails to account for the diverse reasons a woman might seek out a wet nurse to begin with. Even today, in 2022, many women who might want to breastfeed their child cannot, because without meaningful maternity leave or a schedule or space that allows them to pump breast milk, the grueling demands of breastfeeding are often untenable. To quote Lestanger, "The moral rectitude of many breastfeeding advocates, such as the encyclopedists in Rousseau, ignored the social realities faced by parents who were often left with no choice concerning childcare and feeding," end quote. The discussion around breastfeeding and maternal duty were somewhat unique to the French metropole in the 18th century. This is not to say that women living outside of France or in the French colonies were immune to male critique. On the one hand, women from a culture deemed primitive or closer to nature might be romanticized. Such was the case in this painting by Jean-Jacques François Le Barbier. Le Barbier took his subject from the Abbé Raynal, who thought Native Americans' love for their children was worthy of admiration. In his publication of 1770, reeditioned the year before Le Barbier showed his canvas at the Salon in 1781, he claimed that when a Native child died, his parents would go to his grave to weep, and that the mother would even lactate on the grave. Le Barbier drew upon ethnographic descriptions to invent a new model of maternal and paternal duty and of virtuous mourning. That he turned to indigenous figures or customs for such inspiration did not sit well with all salon visitors. One anonymous critic wrote, "Moral lessons are always welcome, no matter their country of origin. But did the artist really need to seek out example from savages?" End quote. Nevertheless, this painting resonated with French artists during the Revolution. Angouf turned it into a print, which he showed at the Salon in 1793, and Joseph Charles Martin created a small terracotta model of the figure in 1795. In many ways, Le Barbier's sympathetic depiction of the Native couple is exceptional in the way it ascribes sentiment and sensibility to non-white figures. As Kyla Schuler has written in The Biopolitics of Feeling, I quote, "Together, impressionability and sentimentalism distinguished civilized bodies as receptive to their milieu and able to discipline their sensory susceptibility. As such, these civilized bodies were cast as in possession of life and vitality that required protection from the threat posed by primitive bodies deemed to be impulsive and insensate, incapable of evolutionary change, whose existence was very close to running out of time," end quote. As my friend and colleague Kylie Stego has argued, the very capacity for feeling was deployed to racialize bodies. The sentimental pictures of Greuze and of Aubry were produced for a white audience and with an eye to improving a white populace thought to be sensitive to reform. Greuze and Aubry's paintings of mothers and nurses and of their breasts idealize the dual sensuality and fecundity of these white female bodies. This manner of depiction only becomes noticeable or remarkable if we think about how these figures contrast with early modern European depictions of African and indigenous North and South American bodies. In the 17th century, European settlers of North America described the bodies of enslaved African women in monstrous terms, in a rhetorical move that dehumanized them and emphasized their sole utility. This utility was, as Jennifer Morgan has written, their ability to produce crops and other laborers, and they were cast as, I quote, animal-like reproductive units. Travel accounts reproduced images of Native American and African women, often showing them with sagging breasts, with parasite-like infants strapped to their backs, sucking from nipples stretched over their shoulders. Images such as this shown here from Theodore Debris's travel narratives offer a kind of evidence, as Morgan has written, that the difference between Black and white women's bodies was both cultural and physical. Their labors within the plantocracy or in birth were framed as natural to them, given their biological difference. I have found few late 18th century images of Black nurses or mothers in the French Caribbean colonies or the metropole. As to the question of wet nursing in the Antilles, in which enslaved or formerly enslaved Black or mixed race women would nurse white Creole children, I have not found documentation to date. By contrast, interracial nursing was common and well documented in the North American antebellum South. That said, in her discussion of the iconography of Black breasts, Anne Lafont has suggested that in the Atlantic world, the exchange of milk did not provoke racial anxiety in white settlers in the way other bodily fluids did. The possibility of a Black nourrice is suggested in this family portrait of the Choiseul family, based in Martinique, which I saw for the very first time in Christelle Lozer's lecture at the Clark yesterday. A rare image of a Black mother is furnished by Agostino Brunius in the stipple engraving of West Indian blanchisseuses, or washerwomen, which was eventually turned into this fantastic button by Brunius, or an unknown maker. Mia Banyas has argued that Agostino's representations of free women of different races in the colonies emerged from a plantocratic paradigm. That is, while in many ways they depict the beauty and agency of free women in the Antilles and in the larger Caribbean, they also originate in and serve a colonialist and pro-slavery agenda. In this image, we gaze upon three women who pause from their labors to stand and chat, like three graces or muses. Notably, darker-skinned women frame or flank their lighter mixed-race companion. The body of the dark-skinned mother is shown less as an object of desire and more as a figure who can endure competing tasks, washing laundry at the same time as she totes her nursling. The kind of maternal intimacy and practices of child-rearing advocated for by philosophes on the French mainland were not extended to colonial subjects of color. This difference was rooted in political efforts to, on the one hand, fortify kinship among the beleaguered nuclear families of the metropole, and on the other, to erode family ties among people who were viewed as subhuman laborers, whose sentimental attachments were viewed as inconvenient and disposable. Returning to France, it is difficult to gauge the degree to which Enlightenment discourse influenced actual nursing practices. In 1783, the chronicler of Parisian life, Louis-Sébastien Mercier, wrote, "For a while, women wanted to nurse themselves, but it was only a mode. It's over. The life of Paris will always be an obstacle to this sacred duty," end quote. This hand-colored satirical print by the British printmaker James Gilray highlights the absurdity of a detached mother offering her breast to her child while otherwise hastening to leave for a night out on the town. Her plumage recalls that of the mother in Aubry's painting. While practices appear to have changed out of obligation, the aristocratic mother's emotional attachment to her child is a far cry from the solid, nurturing posture of a robust country maid suckling her child, like a pastoral Madonna pasted to her wall. Maternal nursing emerges as an ideal in the final years of the 18th century leading up to the French Revolution is clear in surviving works of art, from popular porcelain figures such as this to more ambitious portraits and allegorizing genre scenes. Aubry, in this small painting of an unknown date, depicts the fact that a painter might now find himself busy with a new genre of portrait, that of a breastfeeding mother holding her young children on her lap. One is struck by the difference between the classicizing plaster models stowed on this shelf, which would have formed the basis of his artistic training, and the feminine subject that sits before him, demanding a new set of artistic conventions and approaches to the human form. In Adélaïde Labille-Guillard's 1783 portrait of Madame Charles Mitoire and her children, the aristocratic woman is shown breastfeeding her infant. The female artist's portrait is churning with soft, full flesh and luscious satin that evoke the pleasures and comforts of mother's milk. Despite the vociferous public discourse on breastfeeding, visitors to the salon where it was displayed passed over the pastel's explicit content with hushed embarrassment. The presence of breastfeeding mothers and family portraits did indeed become fairly common, as evidenced by this portrait by Marie-Geneviève Bouliard, or these genre scenes celebrating maternal tenderness and happy families and breastfeeding by the artist Marguerite Girard. As these last few examples evoke, women painters grew in strength and number at the end of the 18th century, and their population exploded leading up to, during, and after the French Revolution. This was due to the establishment of more ateliers that trained women, to the rising status of artists such as Elisabeth Vigée-Lebrun and Adélaïde Labille-Guillard, and ultimately to the dissolution of the Royal Academy of Painting and Sculpture, which had strictly limited the number of women allowed to join the Academy and exhibit at its salon. Not all of these female artists were mothers, but some were, and some represented this dual identity in their art. This was the case in the self-portrait by Marie-Nicole Dumont, who seems to declare joyfully, proudly to the viewer, lean in, you can have it all. You can maintain a practice as an artist at the same time as you can be a doting mother. Such a self-fashioning aligns closely with her unimpeachable Republican values. She was one of 21 female artists and artists' relatives who gave away all of her jewels to support the newly formed National Assembly in 1789, an event captured in this drawing by Guillaume Guillon-Lethière, himself a teacher and champion of women artists, which you can see at right. As anyone who has tried to work while taking care of children during the pandemic can attest, Marie-Nicole Dumont's depiction of her seamless juggling of maternal and professional duties is more of a fantasy than a reality. The possibility of this fusion of duties is also somewhat unique. Had she been a laborer, a laundress, for example, she would have had to either tie her child to her back in defiance of Rousseau's recommendations or leave them with another hired caretaker. Dumont's work situation is predicated on choice, a degree of autonomy and financial security, a flexible schedule, and also a rising celebration at a societal level of the nobility and value of her professional pursuit. I did not write this lecture while taking care of my own child, who was about the same age as the toddler in Aubry's painting. I read about the history of wet nursing and about depictions of motherhood while my son was at daycare, was sleeping, or was with his father. Tonight, my husband is attending this lecture because our wonderful babysitter, Liz, is with him. Étienne Aubry's farewell to the wet nurse was the object of much critical attention in the 1990s and early 2000s. Much has been done in years since to recover the artistic and intellectual contributions of women in this period, from scholars such as Mary Sheriff, Dina Goodman, Joan Dejean, Melissa Hyde, Séverine Sofiot, and Paris Spies-Gantz, who have celebrated the exceptional careers of women such as Vigée-Lebrun, who was a mother herself, and offered correctives to the actual number of women participating meaningfully in cultural production. And yet, by and large, the late Linda Nauckland's provocative question, why have there been no or so few great women artists, remains unanswered. One of the problems, one raised by Aubry's farewell to the wet nurse, lies in the very terms with which we evaluate work. In her reflection on Berthe Morisot's startling painting, which I show here, of the artist's own daughter in the arms of her wet nurse, Linda Nauckland has raised important issues around gender, labor, and representation. Labor is not a logical category, but rather a moral and evaluative category, she wrote. Furthermore, men's leisure is often produced and maintained by women's work, disguised to look like pleasure. A painting made the year after of a woman hanging out the wash conjures troubling questions about the arbitrary nature of hierarchies of labor through the approximation it suggests between skeins of impasto linen and the warp and weft of the artist's canvas. The question of gendered labor in the field of art was one taken up in earnest in the 20th century. In 1968, the French-Argentine artist Léa Lublin staged an exhibition performance called Mon Fils, in which she changed, breastfed, and cared for her son in museums during the May exhibition in Paris. In 1973, Mirla Ladderman-Ukeles performed a 4-part maintenance art, which included washing the steps of the Wadsworth Athenaeum in Hartford, Connecticut. In her maintenance manifesto, written shortly after the birth of her first child, she claimed that artistic mandates of originality and the avoidance of repetition were at odds with the demands of motherhood, which required constant repetition. In 2012, Willie Cole's Beauties, recently exhibited at the Radcliffe Institute for Advanced Study, display large figures printed from ironing boards that have been flattened into matrices that get inked and passed through a heavy-duty intaglio press. At bottom, each is inscribed with the name of a Black woman, one we might imagine as a laundress. As Jennifer Roberts has observed, these figures stand in for both the verticality of a full-length portrait at the same time as they maintain their horizontal memory, that of standing in for the body of the employer whose shirts were ironed upon them. In this configuration, Roberts suggests, Ida May is not just the intaglio plate. As she wields the heat and pressure of the iron, she is also the printmaker. More recently, in her adaptation of Elena Ferrante's novel, The Lost Daughter, director Maggie Gyllenhaal confronts us with a female protagonist, played by Olivia Colman, who shocks us in her willingness to abandon her children for 2 years for the sake of her own professional satisfaction as a translator and literary scholar, not to mention her extramarital sexual desires. When asked how she felt about this elective time away from her children, she said, "It felt amazing." As viewers, we are left to process our own emotional response to this brazen taboo choice, which most of us instinctively feel is monstrous and unnatural. Thank you.